Xi Jinping was in North Korea for the Chinese leader's first visit there in 7 years. What is at stake for these two long-term allies, and why now? I'm Hazem Sika, and today's newsmakers are China and North Korea. It was a summit meant to shore up ties and send a message to rivals. The leaders of China and North Korea pledging closer cooperation in Pyongyang. Xi Jinping and Kim Jong Un agreed to expand their partnership across a range of sectors. But the meeting has also raised bigger questions about shifting alliances in Asia, regional security, and the balance of power in this part of the world. Here's a look.
7 years after his last trip to Pyongyang, Xi Jinping is back in North Korea. But this is not the same North Korea he left behind. The Chinese president and his North Korean counterpart, Kim Jong Un, have pledged closer cooperation as Beijing moves to reinforce ties with a neighbour that has grown increasingly close to Russia. The visit comes as the two countries mark the 65th anniversary of their mutual defence treaty, a partnership that has shaped the Korean peninsula for decades. During talks in Pyongyang, the two leaders agreed to expand cooperation in areas including trade, agriculture, construction, and technology.
I am ready to work with you, General Secretary, to take this visit as an opportunity to strengthen top-level planning and strategic guidance for China, Democratic People's Republic of Korea relations in the new era. Keep bilateral relations advancing with the times and achieve greater progress in bilateral ties so as to better benefit the two countries.
The alliance between Beijing and Pyongyang was forged during the Korean War, and it is China's only formal defense pact. China remains North Korea's largest trading partner and economic lifeline. But Pyongyang is no longer as dependent on Beijing as it was when Xi last visited in 2019. Closer ties with Moscow have provided Pyongyang with new economic and strategic support, giving Kim Jong Un greater room to maneuver on the international stage. Even so, both leaders used the visit to project unity, presenting their relationship as a source of stability despite growing political tensions.
We believe that this visit once again clearly demonstrates that the DPRK and China have always stood on the right side of history, the side of autonomy and justice. It also shows the world that no matter how the international situation may evolve, the time-tested DPRK-China relations remain unbreakable.
Yet one issue was notably absent from public statements following the summit. Neither side publicly addressed North Korea's nuclear program, despite Pyongyang's recent pledge to further expand its nuclear capabilities. The timing of the trip has also drawn particular attention. Xi's visit comes as North Korea's ties with Russia continue to deepen and as questions persist over whether Washington may seek renewed engagement with Kim Jong Un.
I think the Xi visit to North Korea is interesting in the sense that it's come after a slew of visits to Beijing and high-level meetings that Xi's been having with European leaders, with, of course, Donald Trump, with Putin. So I suppose this is a broader effort to cast Beijing as central to world politics in the contemporary period, that things have to go through Beijing.
The visit celebrated one of Asia's oldest political alliances, but it also reflected a new reality. North Korea may still depend on China, yet Beijing is no longer taking that dependence for granted.
Well, joining me now to talk more about this from Beijing, a senior fellow at Taihe Institute, Einar Tangen. From Miami, Florida in the US, Republican strategist and political commentator Angie Wong. And joining us from Pusan in South Korea, Professor of Political Science at Pusan National University, Robert Kelly. Good to have you all with us. So, Einar Tangen, if I could start with you. This is the first visit by the Chinese leader to North Korea in 7 years. Why now?
Well, it's for actually first trip that he's taken this year, so it has a lot of political significance. What you have is a situation where the Philippines, Japan are causing unrest. Japan has made it clear that they want to start expanding their military. And there's a concern that North Korea has been fairly aggressive. I think this was to calm the waters, to go to Pyongyang and say, look, we'll help you out here. You're not isolated anymore. I don't think there was much talk about the nuclear issues, but she has to be the adult in the room. It's not, Beijing is not happy about having a another nuclear force in Southeast Asia. They're concerned about a nuclear arms race. So at this point, the only adult thing to do is to deal with the realities, and that is trying to calm the waters before they get out of control.
Robert Kelly, what's your take on this? What do you see as the significance of this visit and at this time?
Yeah, I think that the North Koreans are doing really well with the Russians because of the war, and this is the Chinese trying to step in to compete. The North Koreans did this back during the Cold War, right? They were able to play the Russians against the Soviets, for the 1990s. And then, of course, the North Korean economy collapsed, and so did the Soviet Union. And so for a while there, the North Koreans were stuck with Chinese patronage only, and that's sort of difficult because that gives China a lot of leverage over North Korea. So once the Ukraine war happened and North Korea got an opening with China, and it could sort of divert through, for example, its sanctions banking evasions through Moscow banks rather than going through China, there was room for the North Koreans to play the Russians against the Chinese. And so now this is a way for the Chinese to get back in there. The North Koreans are really, really good at this game. That's one of the reasons why they got away with building nuclear weapons, because nobody's really willing to put their foot down, because everybody's trying to sort of grab them and hold them, but they keep slipping away. And now what you're seeing is a competition between the Chinese and the Russians for North Korean favor. That's my read of it.
Angie Wong, this visit coming not long after President Trump's visit to Beijing and his meeting with Xi Jinping. How is the administration there going to be looking at this?
Yeah, I've been looking at all of the state visits being made to China right after the Trump-Xi Jinping summit last month. And it really does send a message to the United States that China is trying to make strong alliances with those that, may be against the United States. It shows a common interest that the United States and the United States' influence may be weakened by this new alliance made by Xi Jinping with Russia, with North Korea, Iran, etc. So I think that is the message that is being sent to the Trump administration. The Trump administration may decide to respond or not respond. It could strengthen its alliance in Asia with Japan, with Taiwan, and also with South Korea. So we're going to see if the Trump administration actually jumps at this news of Xi Jinping and Kim Jong Un meeting just this week.
Einar Tangen, I want to talk a little bit more about this visit coming after the close ties between North Korea and Russia. Do you think the relationship between China and North Korea has been strained a bit by Pyongyang's increasingly close relationship with Russia?
Quite the opposite. The elephant in the room is the fact that China and Russia are deepening the relationship. Obviously, Putin was there. It's not just Trump and Putin who came to China. There are 23 nations who made the trip since the beginning of this year. So there's a lot of activity. Obviously, China has primary trade relations with over 140 countries. They're not trying to create bloc politics. Unfortunately, I would have to disagree with my colleague who's sitting in South Korea. This is not about China asserting power over North Korea. Actually, it's to the benefit of China that North Korea feels more comfortable. It has an alternate outlet with Russia, some country that is very, very favorable right now to China. They have a deep economic interest that's going to continue for quite some time. So by having this other outlet, and as you saw during this visit, there was a desire to show that Pyongyang is an equal sovereign nation. There was no inference that they are somehow a junior partner in this. And this is extremely important for Korean pride. So what you saw here was exactly what was going to be advertised. I talked about this in several articles before it started. This was to calm the waters, try to make sure that there isn't a nuclear arms race and that Japan does not have some sort of excuse to start saying that it needs nuclear weapons.
Robert Kelly, you mentioned earlier that North Korea has in the past been able to sort of play one country off against the other and use that to its advantage. But how, if we talk about the economics of this for a moment, how much of an economic lifeline is China for North Korea?
Well, it's the big one, right? I mean, it's pretty well established now that something in excess of 90% of North Korean trade goes through China. Russia's economic importance, though, is that the Russians are willing to pay dollars directly to the North Koreans, which the North Koreans can use for sanction evasion, which is really, really crucial for the Kim family, right? The Russians have also been excluded from much of the world banking system, including the SWIFT system, which means basically at this point the Russians will take anybody's money and they'll do anything really for the cash. They don't really care if the North Koreans have been sanctioned, for example, right? It's always been something where we at least got some cooperation with the Chinese on this. It wasn't always great, but at least the Chinese were sort of willing to go through the motions and sort of not allow too much North Korean money to pile up. In case of the Russians, right, it's pretty clear that there's just no limit and the North Koreans can sort of do whatever they'd like through the Russian banking system, which again is really crucial for North Korean sanctions evasion, right? So China's got the formal above board black market or white market economic relationship, but what really matters to the Kim family, to the court, if you will, that runs the country, is the sanctions evasion program, and that requires dollars, it requires friendly banks, and the Russians are far better for that than the Chinese are at the moment because the Russians are pariahs.
Angie Wong, I know you suggested earlier that the administration in Washington is just kind of keeping a close eye on this for now. But what about this view that a stronger North Korea relationship might make it harder for the U.S. to contain China's influence in Asia?
And that's always been the problem. Clearly Trump has made multiple trips to Asia, trying to put U.S. influence across the region. And China's saying, no, we are still the dominant player here. Trump could do a couple of things, right? I mean, remember in the first Trump administration, Trump went to the DMZ and shook hands with Kim Jong Un. And that was a fantastic moment for his first administration. It seems to have diminished since. But, Trump is the art of the deal president. He could easily go back. I don't think there's a monopoly on China and North Korea necessarily. Trump could make another trip over and shake hands again with Kim Jong Un and maybe even do some trade deals. What he doesn't want is North Korea to develop further a nuclear program because he's already seeing that problem with Iran, right? So he doesn't want to have two issues in two different regions to deal with. I think right now, from what I'm seeing from the American press, people are keeping an eye on this. It's not making anyone in the administration jump just yet. But what Trump ultimately wants is a fair trade deal with China, and this might have caused a speed bump.
Einar Tangen, let's talk a little bit more about the nuclear weapons issue with regards to North Korea. What do you read into the fact that that subject was not really mentioned much in the public discussion of all of this?
That ship has sailed. I mean, you remember Donald Trump was going to take care of that, the art of the deal in his first term. It didn't work out. It fell flat. He showed up in Singapore and just, Kim said, well, let's make a deal. And his idea of a deal was that you give up your nuclear weapons and we'll talk about lifting sanctions. That was a non-starter. China recognizes that they have nuclear weapons. It's not about further developing. It just means that they'd have more warheads, kind of like Israel. So at this point, China recognizes the status quo and is trying to work pragmatically to make sure that the waters are as calm as possible. I keep going back to this issue that, here you have the United States with 400 bases around China. The idea that it's China that's being assertive when it's U.S. warships going up and down the Taiwan Straits is kind of silly. But, there are those that believe American exceptionalism gives it the right to impose its values and its rules on the rest of the world, regardless of whether it follows it or not.
Angie Wong, how do you respond to that, and in particular the North Korea's nuclear program and how that's generally viewed in the U.S.?
I mean, it's always been a threat, and that's how it's viewed. But, the silence on denuclearization during this two-day summit was loud and clear. It showed that Beijing wants North Korea to keep their nukes and to have that leverage over, I guess, the U.S. and the region. And it's something that I think it is a hard line for President Trump. But again, he's got so many things on the plate right now. I don't know if he's going to tackle this one.
Robert Kelly, what's your view on this? And I want to ask you as well, since you're talking to us from South Korea, how will this affect the calculation of the new South Korean government now?
Well, the current South Korean government is sort of the left, and they're sort of fairly dovish on both China and North Korea. The current president said when he was a candidate that if there was a conflict over Taiwan, that South Korea should sit it out. And that really caused waves in sort of the think tank community back in the U.S. Certainly under a leftist president in South Korea's not really willing to align clearly with the United States and Japan against China. The South Koreans really don't want to participate, or at least a good chunk of the South Korean population doesn't want to participate in that kind of coalition. The South Koreans are trying to walk between the raindrops, if you will, between the U.S. and China, and it's getting to be tricky. I have a sense that at some point they're going to be forced to make a decision, but they've done a pretty good job actually for a while of avoiding doing that openly. On the nuclear program, I think the Chinese have basically sort of made the assessment that pushing the North Koreans too hard to rein in their nuclear ambitions isn't worth the cost, that North Korea is a useful troublemaker, disruptor, spoiler in Northeast Asia that keeps the Americans and South Koreans and the Japanese distracted, arguing among themselves. It keeps American forces focused on this region rather than in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, right? As long as North Koreans are running around sort of making trouble for the rest of us in the sanctions evasion that I referenced before, right? The Chinese sort of benefit from that distraction vis-a-vis the sort of emerging Sino-US competition. I don't actually think the Chinese would like the North Koreans to have nuclear weapons, but I think they made the calculation over the last 25 years that they're willing to tolerate that for other goals, because if the Chinese really wanted to crack down on North Korean nuclear weapons, they could have done a great deal on this 25 years ago, right? I mean, South Koreans have been talking to the Chinese about working on North Korean nuclear weapons literally since the 1990s. And we've just gotten very, very little on this. So, here we are, right? And now, the Chinese are, my sense is, sort of bad faith to say, well, now that North Korea has these weapons, God forbid the Japanese or the South Koreans build their own, right? Because at some point, North Korea's nuclearization is going to start provoking its neighbors to think of the same thing too, right? The ship sailed 20 years ago. China could have stopped North Korea then. It would have been a lot easier to maintain a denuclearized Korean peninsula if the Chinese had helped us 20 years ago before North Korea got to this point, but they didn't. And so now you've got a nuclearization debate in South Korea. My own sense is that South Korea will probably have nuclear weapons within 10 years, because right now what you've got is this widening imbalance in which South Korea has no weapons at all, and the North Koreans are building, something like 5 to 8 every year. By 2030, 2035, that's just going to be unsustainable for South Korean security, and going to build these things no matter what the Americans or the Chinese say.
Einar Tangen, what's your view on that? The suggestion that China's tolerance for North Korea's nuclear program, it could spark an arms race in this region.
Well, obviously, it's not tolerance. My colleague forgets history. The fact is that Clinton made a deal, Bush didn't follow through on it, and that restarted the program. It's much like what happened in Iran. There was an agreement, and then they walked away from it. In Bush's case, he slow-walked it, and they lost patience. They didn't get what they were asked for. So, yes, the U.S. did fail in this. Did China try to oppose it? Absolutely. They voted in the United Nations against it for sanctions on this idea that somehow it's to China's advantage to have a nuclear neighbor like this is nonsense. No one wants that, not even the United States. So I think we have to be very clear about what China is trying to do. They're dealing with the situation as it has evolved through a series of missteps on the U.S. side. They have not been willing participants. They still trade with it because there's concerns about the military presence, U.S. military presence in South Korea. China does not want eyeball-to-eyeball situation between American and Chinese troops. That was why they stepped in during the Korean War, and that's still true today.
Angie Wong, what's the concern, or is there a concern in the U.S. right now that that this may spark an arms race, a new arms race in the region?
I think one thing to watch is what Pete Hegseth is going to do. That's our Secretary of War, whether or not we're going to be moving more troops into the region, more armory into the region, anything of that sort. I know President Trump is being very sensitive to this because Xi Jinping is due for 2 visits here in the U.S. in September and perhaps later on in the year in Miami for the G7. So, he does not want to trip that up in any way. He does want to have some level of peaceful negotiations. President Trump returned from his trip from Beijing, with very, very positive vibes. And I think he wants to do a deal versus go into another conflict, especially in Asia. But it is going to be really interesting to see what the Pentagon does next, because that is going to either tell us there's been a spark and that the U.S. needs to be involved, or if President Trump is going to ask the Pentagon to stand down on this one.
Robert Kelly, does the Korean leader, Kim, now have enough alternatives that he can resist Chinese pressure, if there is any Chinese pressure?
Choice of 2 patrons is better than 1, right? I mean, I think what the North Koreans would really prefer is sort of the 1990s and the 2010s, when they were actually able to talk to the South Koreans, the Americans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Russians all at the same time, right? I mean, the North Koreans are sort of really good at gimmicking these kinds of negotiations, and they did that really well during the 6-party talks. So, but now I think on our side, sort of, if you will, the U.S., South Korea, Japan camp, I think there's sort of an exasperation with prolonged negotiations in North Korea that didn't work in the agreed framework in the 90s. It didn't really work in the 6-party talks. And then in the various sort of U.S. efforts with Barack Obama and with Donald Trump, you didn't get anything really either. And so I think the Overton window has moved to the right, if you will. I think there's a greater tolerance for sort of hawkish options vis-a-vis North Korea, right? In part because the North Koreans won't stop building. So it's not really clear to me like what kind of negotiated outcome here. I mean, I don't know, maybe the Chinese can pull a rabbit out of the hat if the South Koreans leave the NPT. I think that's a possibility. But other than that, I kind of foresee a spiraling arms race. And I would imagine, like I said before, that at some point the Japanese and the South Koreans are going to start responding with a substantial military buildup. And again, I don't want to sort of get into a fight here, but I mean, the Chinese kind of brought this on themselves. They had the chance 20 years ago to really step in and lay down the law, if you will, on North Korea and really sort of push for harder sanctions, not water them down. And they didn't, and sort of looked the other way while the North Koreans built these things. The South Koreans really, particularly the South Koreans, much more than the Americans, really wanted to work with China on this back, 10, 15 years ago when Park Geun-hye was president, and it just didn't happen. And now here we are, right? We're sort of sliding into an arms race. And I'm not really sure how we're going to get out of that. I actually don't think we will.
I'll put this to Angie Wong. What do you think about this idea that China could have done more a lot sooner in trying to stop or at least slow down North Korea's journey to a nuclear weapon?
I'm not sure if they would have wanted to, because Xi Jinping does what he wants. He doesn't have election cycles. He thinks in decades, not every 2 years like here in the US. So, if he wanted to do something 20 years ago, he would have done it. But maybe he didn't want that, and maybe the continual supply of food and supplies to North Korea was just enough to kind of keep them on the line. And maybe that strategy has now changed as of this 2-day summit that just took place. Clearly, China now sees North Korea as a strategic partner versus someone that was, almost like they were taking care of a child for a long time. And I hate to say it that way, but that's kind of what it seemed like with the endless supplies of food going to North Korea. And they were controlling North Korea for the last 2 to 3 decades with that respect. So, now it's different because now Putin's involved, now Donald Trump is involved, and China wants to assert that, this is my partner, this is my alliance, and we influence Asia, not everybody else.
Einar Tangen, I want to put that question to you then about the criticism of China that it could have done more with North Korea to steer it away from a nuclear weapons program. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, Well, two corrections for my colleague. First off, China is not a member of the G7, so the likelihood of Xi Jinping showing up for that meeting is zero. Second, he wasn't in power 20 years ago, so this idea that he was going to change something is nonsense. The fact is that China was not in favor of North Korea having nuclear weapons. It tried to work with other powers. The U.S. stepped in and unilaterally said that they were going to take care of this. As my colleague in South Korea mentioned, there were two aborted tries to do it, didn't follow through. Donald Trump said he was going to do it. He certainly didn't do it at all. So, I mean, there is this narrative coming from Washington that somehow it's always China's fault, never the U.S. Every single war that we started, everything is all China's fault. And, you know, it's very seductive because you don't want to take it on the chin for a political system that is failing its people. Over 60% of Americans are very fragile. They don't have the kind of $400-600 in a banking account in case they run into real trouble. They feel that they're going paycheck to paycheck. And yet we're talking about North Korea as if this is the only issue. China is doing, as I said, pragmatically dealing with a situation that it has. It does not control North Korea, never has. In fact, there were troops that didn't make it back, went to South Korea.
We'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much to all three of you for being on the Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Hazem Sika. We'll see you next time.